actually start, I wanted to first thank you all for allowing me to address you all. I didn't know that this was going to be this is you all's first meeting of the year. So I appreciate you all inviting me into your space and being able to speak with you all and sharing this moment with you all. I always view time as one of those assets, what I call critical assets. Once you spend it, it's gone. It's gone forever. You can't regain it. You can't recoup it. And you can't earn it back, you know, like some resources such as money, so on and so forth. And so I understand how important time is. And so I appreciate you all spending this time or allowing me to spend this time with you. And hopefully my remarks will help you move forward in a positive direction along your journey in terms of becoming professionals in the world and critical thinkers as well. So yeah, I just want to express my appreciation for that. So without further ado, I'll get into the presentation. So as stated before, the theme for tonight was conscious forefathers. And so I'll be speaking about that directly, but I did frame it within a context that kind of opens it up a little bit more for us, not simply to look at individuals who have contributed to providing access for people of color in the area of education, but more along, I'm trying to define a tradition that has been created. And this tradition has been created within the particular racial climate that we exist in. And so hopefully you all can walk away with a better understanding in terms of, one, the racial condition that we exist in today, but also how to address and confront those conditions. All right. So I'm going to start with a quote by James Baldwin, which he states, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced," which essentially means that part of this intellectual tradition, which I'll talk about much more later, deals with actually addressing challenges that stand before you. And those challenges are not going to walk away on their own. In fact, we have people in our society that benefit from those challenges that we have currently existing, remaining at the forefront in terms of society. So it's on our shoulders to be able to be active agents, to be able to begin to remove, we'll have discussions about them, right? Critically engage them and begin the work in terms of removing those barriers that's before us, all right? So I will be discussing men of color as forefathers who provide educational access. To begin, I find it necessary to center this conversation within the historical context that has shaped the experience of African, indigenous, and other people of color in the United States. This context is rooted in the racial politics of white supremacy, which has thoroughly been entrenched in every facet of America's institutional and cultural fabric. This is important to note because we are having conversations about race and racism, and new concepts have come forth in terms of being anti-racist, which is very important, right? And so I think part of what we have to do is be able to define what white supremacy is, so we can have a clear understanding of what it is. So when we're actually engaging and attempting to overcome white supremacy as an ideology, but also the manifestations of it being institutionalized. So for the purpose of this research, I define white supremacy as thought and practice that seeks to institutionalize and normalize the exploitation and oppression of people of color for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system that procures white wealth, white power, white privilege, and white domination, right? And so one of the things that I want to emphasize here is not just a thought, right? It's not simply a thought, it's also action. And so one of the things that has been mentioned numerous times in the current discussion in terms of the racial climate that we have in our society is that racism is systemic. And essentially what that means is that it has infused itself and informs many of the institutions that make up our society. So for example, if you look at the diagram to the right, which has white supremacy at the center, is essentially stresses that white supremacy has played a role in terms of the outcomes of many institutions that make up our society. So for example, religion, education, military, health and healthcare, law enforcement, politics, economics, mass media, and there's more, but these are the core 8 that I focus on when talking about defining white supremacy. And just to give you a more, direct answer, or illustration of what this looks like, think about the images when we're talking about mass media. Think about the images that are projected to represent people of color, right? The Latinx community, right? The African or African-American community, right? And other communities of color, in contrast to their European counterparts, right? So again, this is an example in which, if you put it in context to the definition, a system that procures white wealth, privilege, power, these images do not stand alone. These images inform the minds of people who come in contact with the stimuli itself, right? So which essentially means is, as people interact with you, those images play a role in terms of their reference point of dealing with you, right? And so by white supremacy, we're talking about that thought, that philosophical position that actually places you as a second-class citizen without your actions ever coming to the forefront. So from this definition, we can see how American education has aided and abetted in advancing the myth of white intellectual superiority. I acknowledge that I'm using legal jargon to identify this offense because in my eyes, it's a crime against humanity, right? The idea that people of European descent have more worth as it relates to their life, have contributed more to the intellectual projects that all human beings have contributed to, it's an offense. To a large extent, it's an undermining of other people's humanity, people of color specifically, their humanity, their contributions to our society, our contributions to the intellectual project and the quest for truth that I talked about before, right? For men of color, they have historically contributed to advancing intellectual thought while dismantling barriers that deny people of color educational institutions, as well as the resources that come along with those institutions, right? In exploring this topic, when I use the term forefather, I'm referring to a community of men that initiate and contribute to intellectual tradition that rejects and challenges the idea of policies that support barriers that provide exclusive access to primarily white men, right? So we know white supremacy to be a race-based system, but even within its context, women are also pushed to the margins as well, right? This is the merging between thought and practice, the moving of white supremacy as a thought to policy and practice. For this discussion, education refers to intellectual traditions that is rooted in a quest for truth, as I mentioned before. At its core, education is committed to the unearthing of knowledge that allows us to accurately understand the world and how things function. The ancient Kemetic wisdom of the now Valley civilization understands education as an evolutionary process of growth aimed at becoming one with God. Of course, this idea fits within the context of African cosmological and epistemological understandings of humans and their interactions with the universe. If we come more contemporary times, we can look at the scholar warrior John Henry Clarke, who defines the function of education as training students to be proper handlers of power, which essentially means if you're being educated, at the end of the day, that education should transform you with critical thinking and necessary skills to be able to acquire power, but also recognize where power is so you can seize it, right? And if it's not doing that, then there's something wrong with it. It may not be education, it might be something else. It might be socialization, or it might be transforming you into something else, right? From this, my assessment is that men of color that our forefathers are those that have committed themselves through their work toward dismantling the myth that people of color are second-class citizens in the human marketplace of ideas. If we look at the work of LeGarrette King, he argues that the manipulation of history has left out Blacks' educational challenge to the narrative of the men who contributed or attributed to it the founding of American education. The founders of Black education founded educational institutions, and I would even go further to argue that these men, along with their women counterparts, make up what Cedric Robertson calls the Black radical tradition, right? King identifies the work of this particular community that I just identified as critical intellectual agency. And so first I want to take a moment to look at what the Black radical tradition is, right? First, if we were to define what the Black radical tradition is, the key point that should be highlighted is that it's a tradition of resistance through critical thought and action that challenges systems and systems of thought that reinforce structural oppression for the purpose of maintaining domination of Black and other people of color. If we were to move a little bit deeper in terms of the concept of Black radical tradition, it's intentional forms of resisting domination for actualizing structural shifts toward a just society. So even though, you know, the term Black is in this concept, it's not simply a concept that's directed for people of African descent or Black people, right? This tradition is actually a tradition that seeks to transform society to be a more just society. And by just, it means that the playing field is level, in which everyone can have equal stake to the resources that are made available to the citizens of this country, right? Thirdly, it's committed to developing an interior critique of oppression, right? Which essentially means that our discourse around oppression and what it is and its impact should be informed by those who have been impacted by oppression. And so if we were to argue that the racial climate of America is deeply rooted in terms of white supremacy, it means that people of color should be at the forefront in terms of this discourse around structural racism, and not only the defining it, but coming up with strategies to actually remove and liberate people from color from these destructive institutions. The last point in terms of the Black radical tradition is it extends beyond response and affirmation. Its discourses, activities, and sources both challenge the West and open new lines of inquiry on some of the fundamental ideas associated with Western civilization, right? And essentially what this means is that the West is a different beast altogether from a historical standpoint and even in a contemporary standpoint, right? Mr. Flowers had mentioned earlier 1619, and he referenced the institution of slavery, a point in which people of African descent were enslaved for an extensive period of time, right? It's been over 400 years from that point. And essentially what I'm getting at is the enslavement or the slavery, the institution of slavery here in the Western world is different from any institution of slavery that we know in terms of mankind, right? The enslavement of the West was not the first time a human population had been enslaved, where individuals of the human population have been enslaved and forced to work. However, Western institution of slavery is the first in which a population of people were forced to be enslaved on a lifelong term, which means that you were enslaved from the time that you were born to the time that you had met your demise and you had died. That was a new form of slavery introduced to human beings. And more importantly, essentially what that institution did was create a hierarchy as it relates to race, right? And within that hierarchy, there's a group at the top There's groups at the bottom, and in between there's a pecking order, with people of color being at the bottom, or, you know, at the bottom of that pecking order, if you will, right? And so in terms of questioning Western civilization, is questioning this new racial context that had been created out of thin air, right? Nowhere, right? When you think about the institution of slavery, in terms of 1619, but the first wave of Africans that were taken from the continent and went to Europe, Portugal specifically, we're talking about 1492, right? And the funny thing about this is, I joke with my classes all the time, we are socialized around the year 1492. I can see you all's remarks in the chat section. If there's anyone that has a specific reference point for 1492, please type it in. I'm not gonna wait, but I just want you all to you know, let me know that you all have heard of the year 1492, and if so, what is generally associated with it, right? So with that regard, I'll, as you all talk, I'll speak to the importance of 1492. In many cases, in the American educational system, Christopher Columbus and his history is cemented in terms of 1492. I'm pretty sure you all learned this in elementary school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The reason why this is important specifically for this is, while we learned about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue, and that same year was the first wave of Africans taken out of Africa and placed in Europe for the purpose of enslavement, right? And so with that, created a racial hierarchy that had been established in the Western world, right? But will become a global approach in terms of not only African people, but other people of color as well. This idea where people of European descent are placed at the top of the pecking order and are deemed to be superior in all regards. And so when I'm speaking about the Black radical tradition, I'm talking about resisting these notions and these myths, right? Creating spaces for African people as well as other people of color to be able to challenge these thoughts and engage these thoughts, right? I want to share you all, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to share another document with you all. When we talk about race and racism, and many times in our country, they relegate it to an idea that belongs to white racists in the South, right? As if it was created there and they are the individuals that project and reinforce and hold strong to these things. What I would say is that's false, right? Racism was an intellectual idea that was incubated on college campuses around the world, meaning that it was intellectualized, right? When we look at the various scholars, even some scholars that we know and we study or are forced to study today, engage in the intellectualizing of racism in our society. So for example, Hume, Kant, Voltaire, Hegel, right? All of them have played a role in terms of what we call scientific racism, which is a quest to prove European intellectual superiority over people of color. This particular diagram looks specifically at people of African descent, but essentially this is supremacy had infused intellectual institutions such as colleges and other campuses in which that idea was researched, right? Thoroughly researched and written about to reinforce this idea that people of African descent were inferior, and that this pecking order that was created during the 1400s and 1500s were to be reinforced and normalized to the point was not to be questioned, that it would just be, if you will, right? It would be part of our consciousness, and we would move and operate as if it was fact and it was true. I would like to point out also that some of the people that we learn about in history, right? Look at it in terms of Abraham Lincoln, which is the first on the right-hand side in his remarks as it relates to people of African descent. I only point this out because, again, even our understanding of the Civil War, right, is misconstrued and not fully explored in terms of why the Civil War was fought and the images that are attached to some of the figures that are on this list. And I say that to say Abraham Lincoln has always been those figures that were socialized to believe were the saviors of people of African descent, right? That he was the individual that enacted the Emancipation Proclamation based on his understanding of African people being mistreated, which is false. He even stated it during the war that he didn't care if slavery lived or if it died. What he cared was for securing the Union. And that's important. That needs to be a part of our conversation because, again, when we're talking about ratifying some of the public policy that places us as second-class citizens, we have to understand the players, their roles historically, but also we need to be able to identify when that thought walks into the room, if you will, right? So going further in terms of the Black radical tradition, first and foremost, it advances our ancestors' legacy in terms of resisting that notion and resisting oppression, right? It's asserting our right to determine our own destiny, which means that our destiny should not be limited to the confines of public opinion, but rather defined by the communities in which we come from, right? And the cultural practices that we feel are important for us to engage in to be able to obtain liberation, right? Also, the Black radical tradition is seeking to move human civilization forward. And I only state this to say that, again, the Black radical tradition is not just a community of people of African descent that are engaging in this resistance. It's a human project in which human beings have contributed to this notion of developing a very just society for all people, right? And finally, defining and protecting African and people of color's humanity, right? Part of this tradition is saying that rejecting white supremacy is preserving people of color's place in society as human beings, but also that without our input, critical thought wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be there, right? That's not to say that people of European descent does not engage in critical thought, but if they were to engage in it with no challenge, then again, what makes it critical, right? What makes it radical, right? And so with that stated, that we have to be present and we have to contribute to the dialogue and the discourse around shaping our society and shaping the larger world, all right? So what's the significance in terms of advancing the Black radical tradition? First and foremost, it preserves the tradition of radical thought that challenges injustice. And this tradition is not only developed and not only contributed by people of African descent. We know that there's been collaboration of all people who have been oppressed in our society. And so when we're talking about preserving the tradition of radical thought, we're talking about all those who engage in radical thought, right? That challenges injustice, right? Resist attempts to reframe or redefine radical for people of color, right? This is very dear because even in mainstream news today, there's discourse around social protests today, right? If we were to rewind back about 4 years ago and we were to take Colin Kaepernick's demonstration on the football field, for example, right? If you look at the language that was used, his demonstration was largely deemed to be radical, right? And within context of the NFL, that might be deemed to be radical. But if you take it outside of the contemporary discourse around race and the NFL itself, which is a largely conservative organization, I don't know if it would be deemed to be radical, right? And so my point with this is saying that it's people of color who have been oppressed, as well as other marginalized people's role to define what radical is, not those who maintain positions of power and who benefit from the exploitation and oppression of marginalized groups, right? And so part of this discourse is a pushback of us not allowing others to define what's radical for us, right? Radical should be defined by those who are engaging in the demonstrations themselves, right? Because the problem is, if you allow those who are not engaged and those who are not committed to movements that are currently happening to define what's radical, they can push the needle to a point to where anything that challenges the status quo can be deemed unacceptable. So for example, if we look at the commentary on what's happening in the streets as it relates to police brutality and police killing of unarmed women and children and men, right? We've seen the discourse revolve around radical protest, or this idea that radical protest has been used to challenge these issues. The idea here is that marching could be deemed to be radical in a very conservative context, but in a larger context, it's not radical. Essentially what it is it's a challenge for local governments to address things that have happened under their watch, right? And so we can't allow, those who are not committed and not engaged in these movements to redefine what's radical for us, which may inform our interactions in terms of protest, right? Links contemporary protest to historical legacy of resistance, which means that what's happening now is a reflection of things that have happened historically in times, right? Protest in terms of police brutality is not new. While this is a new wave and it feels a lot new, it feels new and it feels as if this is something different. It's not something that is different, right? It's something that that has happened historically, and our understanding of the contemporary unfolding of things have to be placed within the historical context for us to have an accurate understanding of what's happening, right? And so again, we have to link contemporary protests with protests that have happened in the past, because in many cases, they mirror each other. So for example, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was largely organized because of police brutality in Black and brown communities, right? And so again, that's a whole organization that spearheaded many Black Power organizations and Black Power ideology of the time. And so again, that was at the forefront of the Black Power movement. That was at the forefront or central to the Civil Rights movement, right? If we look at movements that are prior to that, with the Deacons of Defense, for example, which was a part of the Civil Rights movement, largely their role in civil rights movements was to make sure that angry mobs, as well as police, were not harming and killing demonstrators. And so again, we have to understand this phenomenon to be linked with historical events, so we don't believe that this is just new land and a new circumstance that we're existing in. Lastly, centralizes the narrative of those that are resisting, which means that it's the community's responsibility to be at the forefront of defining what's central in terms of the movements that are happening and what's central to the principles that we are standing on and the objectives that we're attempting to accomplish, right? And so from this Black radical tradition, I know I have to run here, I'll move it. In terms of this Black radical tradition, we can begin to identify people and institutions that have engaged and contributed to this Black radical tradition. So for example, if you look at the Free African Aid Society of Philadelphia, right, which was founded by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, right, which is a society that dealt with providing resources for formerly enslaved Africans as well as free Africans, right? What came out of it was a number of institutions that helped to stabilize and secure free communities of Blacks as well as people of color, to make sure that they have access to religious institutions, educational institutions, but also to have access to business opportunities, as well as resources for those who didn't have resources for themselves. So also what came out of that was aid societies in which those who didn't have could have access to resources. So for example, when people passed away and the family didn't have money to bury their loved ones, they developed aid societies that would help and aid them in that situation in terms of burying their loved ones. But another example would be in instances where enslaved Africans escaped and ran away. And once they made it north, there was an aid society available for them so they can have resources, they can have a place to live, and they can have resources to be able to feed, clothe themselves, and eventually learn a trade to be able to make money for themselves. And so I identify the Free African Aid Society as one of these organizations that contribute to the Black radical tradition, because again, it rejects that notion, but also simultaneously provides resources for the community that is on the margin, and largely that's people of color, right? We also can identify individuals like W.B. Du Bois, for example, who is a master scholar in his own right. The wealth of work that he's produced over his lifetime is almost overwhelming. And I say that because, you know, as a young man, right, looking at my production and my productivity, it pales in comparison to some of these intellectual giants, right? And so if we look at W.B. Du Bois, he organized the first 2 Pan-African conferences, right? Which is a response to the Berlin Conference, which again, it set off the wave of colonization, global colonization by European countries, right? But essentially, this is a conference that seeks to address European nations invading other countries and colonizing certain groups, which again, the Latin America, the Africa, the continent, and other parts of the world fall victim to this colonial endeavor, right? He's the founder of the Niagara movement, which out of that comes the NAACP, the National Association for the Color of People, the advancement of colored people, right? Which played a very instrumental role in terms of civil rights. And again, furthering this tradition in terms of challenging white supremacy, right? He's a leading intellectual in terms of the new Negro movement, which happened during the Harlem Renaissance. He's the father of modern day sociology, and he's one of the widest published scholars in the 20th century. He's the premier scholar on race in the 20th century as well. So if we look at other figures, and I'll be quick and I'll move to my recommendations, we can look at people like Molefi Asante, right, for example, who developed the theory of Afrocentricity, which again is a push to reshift how African people are studied and viewed in the world, right? He's the first individual to develop a PhD program in the discipline of Africana Studies at Temple University, right? And not only that, he's the premier scholar that attempts to reshift our understanding of Africa, classical Africa, as well as modern day African contributions to human civilization. All right? I will end with this because I know I'm close to the deadline. My recommendations in terms of you all preparing yourself to be future forefathers. First, be intentional with your time and your genius. We all know that you all are geniuses and you all bring something to the table. So You need to be intentional with your time, which means that as you perform, make sure that you put yourself in a position to put your best foot forward, right? Make sure that you invest time in things that you care about and things that you can fully commit yourself to, right? Because like I stated before, time is one of those rare assets that once it's gone, it's gone. You can't recoup it. So don't waste your time, which leads us to the second point. Commit yourself to produce excellence. That doesn't mean that you have to be perfect, but what it does mean is if you know that you have to produce something, even if that's something as simple as a paper in class, make sure that you strive for excellence. And excellence is how you define it at that time. So whatever your standard of excellence is, make sure that you at least produce that, right? And we all know that our ideas of excellence, it'll change as we get older. So we have to commit ourselves to that we're at least being excellent within our own eyes. The third point is to challenge ourselves to consistently be present and active, right? We have to be present. And what I mean by present, yes, physically present, but mentally present as well. When we walk into spaces, we want to be present psychologically as well as physically. To make sure that as we are becoming advocates for our communities, that we are advocating on the right side of history, right? And that we are doing the right things to make sure that that we get the desired outcomes that we are seeking. And lastly is to consult your community of elders to make sure that there's a checks and balances that are in place. So it's not just you evaluating your behavior, it's those that you respect, those that you see as mentors, those that you see as leaders in the field, that they're able to have a say at what you're doing to make sure that you're on the right path. And so lastly, I'll end with a Yoruba passage, and this goes along with the recommendation. Essentially, it says, watch what you think, because what you think becomes what you say. Watch what you say, because what you say becomes what you do. Watch what you do, because what you do becomes your habits. Watch your habits, because your habits become your character. Lastly, watch your character, because your character becomes your destiny. And essentially what this means is that your final destination begins with your thoughts. And so be careful, be intentional in terms of identifying what you're thinking. Sometimes it's hard, ideas just come to mind and it goes, it flows, and it grows, right? We have to be intentional of what comes out of our minds or what we're thinking about. For example, negativity. It's easy to think about negativity and let it grow. We have to stop it at its bud and be intentional, because then it'll become what we say, then what we do, then it'll become habit, it'll be our character, and eventually it'll become our destiny, meaning where we end.